These days, hydrogen as a low carbon fuel is a very hot topic. My inbox is full every day from hydrogen organizations or somebody promoting hydrogen or reporting on hydrogen. And also, you would not be surprised to learn that many of the folks in the energy community are technical people. They're engineers or they have a technical background of some other kind. Maybe they're economists. And I get a lot of queries about why hydrogen is economic. For instance, if you make blue hydrogen out of natural gas, they say, why don't you just ship the natural gas in a pipeline or as LNG and let somebody else convert it to hydrogen and do whatever they want with it? If it's green hydrogen, where you need renewable electricity, they say, why don't you just ship the electricity to them over transmission lines, and then use it, in electric processes, electric technologies. Well, I'm going to talk to Dr. David Layzell, who is a professor at the University of Calgary and the energy systems architect for the nonprofit Transition Accelerator, about the economics of hydrogen, why it is economic, and why it makes sense. So welcome to the interview, David.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Now, we're going to get into the weeds on this a little bit in just a moment. But if you had an Alberta oil and gas engineer, and you were, in the kind of conversations I have, and no doubt you have as well, and they said, why just not ship them out natural gas? Why not just ship them the electricity? Let the customer worry about how he wants to use it. If he wants to convert it into hydrogen or just use it with natural gas. Isn't that the most efficient, low-cost means of doing it, as opposed to going, through electrolysis or methane steam reforming? Well, how would you respond to that?
Well, I think obviously the big issue here is climate change, and if you ship them natural gas, that's great. When they burn the natural gas, it gives you energy, it gives you heat energy or the energy you might want to run a process, but it also releases CO2. And many parts of the world don't have the geological resources to actually store that CO2. And also, when a typical user uses only a small amount of methane at one time, and so the amount of CO2 isn't very great. And in order to make carbon capture and storage work, one has to do it at a large scale. Typically, the rule of thumb that we use is about 2 million tons of CO2 per year is kind of where geological carbon capture and storage actually works, and you could make it. And you can really only handle that scale of carbon dioxide production in very large industrial facilities. So obviously, handing people methane to burn in their house, or to put in a vehicle, to drive a vehicle, the amount of you just can't handle the small amount of CO2 through millions of vehicles or millions of homes, and you just can't capture that CO2. It ends up going to the atmosphere. So if we're really interested in addressing climate change, we really need zero emission energy carriers. Could be electricity or it could be hydrogen. Now, if you want electricity, move electricity. If you need hydrogen, it's actually cheaper to move hydrogen in a pipeline than it is to move electricity in a wire, especially when you're starting in large quantities.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so the argument here, I guess, is if we need low carbon fuels, then hydrogen may not be the most efficient. It may not be the lowest cost form of energy, but it's low enough cost and efficient to be economic, and it solves a very pressing problem that has other higher costs and other higher impacts that we are really worried about.
Well, exactly. And I think a lot of it is electricity doesn't store very well. You can store it in a battery, but it's expensive and it's quite heavy. Hydrogen, of course, is a chemical form of an energy carrier. And the reality is when you look at different parts of our economies and energy systems, in some parts of our energy system, electricity is the better energy carrier. In others, electricity doesn't work very well. If you're flying an airplane, you can't give enough energy in a battery to get the plane off the ground and fly long distances. So you need a chemical form of energy storage, big ships as well, trains, heavy trucks. And so in those cases, the ability to store and to move the energy with you and use it when you need it has a real advantage. And those are the parts of our new energy system that we're trying to see emerge where hydrogen plays a particularly valuable role.
So let me sum this up at a very high level, David. And maybe this is like a principle of the energy transition, is we have to move to a net zero economy, a net zero energy system. And we have we have a variety of fuels, electricity, hydrogen, foremost among them, and they all have different applications in various parts of the economy: buildings, transportation, power sector, industry, and having that. Even though hydrogen may not be as perfectly efficient as some other fuel, but in the overall scheme of things, it's the lowest cost and most efficient for that application.
Yes, and best fit for service. We often use the fit for service. You might have something that could be lower cost in the short term, but if it's not going to actually meet the need that you have for the energy service you're trying to provide, then it's not going to work. And there's cost is really important. Let's be honest, it's very important, but it's not the only thing. And efficiency is very important. But sometimes, convenience, efficiency, fit for service is more important than efficiency, or even more important than incremental cost for the electricity. Because ultimately, the cost is what's the impact on the overall cost of what the service you're trying to deliver. And sometimes it's better to pay a little bit more for your energy, and because it actually saves maybe saves labor, or it saves more convenience, gives you a better product in the end. And that's really the market's going to decide that.
Yeah, that's where I was going with my next question, is the role of the market here in sorting out what's most efficient and what's most economic in which application. So for instance, I know you're involved, the Transition Accelerator is involved in a pilot project with two Class 8 semi freight hauler, it's a freight hauling pilot project between Alberta and Edmonton and Calgary in Alberta, using hydrogen to fuel those trucks. And just yesterday, Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, tweeted out that they're starting to deliver Tesla semi trucks. They've got these Class 8 trucks. They've got a range of 500 miles. Okay, so now we have your hydrogen pilot project and others that are taking place around the world. We now have an electric semi truck, but the market will sort out which one is more economic and better fit for service in different applications.
Yes, and I think there's a role for both. When in our analysis, and certainly in working with the trucking companies that want to deliver trucking services, or the manufacturers that are making these vehicles, in medium duty trucks that are typically delivering under 15 tons of a gross vehicle weight for the truck. Electric vehicles they're often driving shorter distances. Plug-in electric makes a lot of sense. When you actually get to longer range trucks and carrying very large loads, and in Alberta and across Canada, we have a lot of most of the freight is moved on these 63-ton gross vehicle weight trucks, which you try to put batteries on those things, and they need to be driving many hundreds of kilometers, like 400 or 500 kilometers between refueling. Then it's very, very challenging, and they want a really rapid refuel. When they pull in, the driver is being paid by the hour. They have to get their stuff to market. They can't stop in and take 2 hours to charge a vehicle. They are going to need to get in, get refueled, and move on. And that's where most of the companies are recognizing, the companies that are manufacturing these vehicles, and certainly the carriers are much more interested in hydrogen options, hydrogen fuel cell options for the heavy freight side. So that's the target. We started this AZTEC project with the Alberta Motor Transport Association, with a number of other industry partners, Trimac and Bison in the trucking, with Ballard Fuel Cells and Dana Transport designing the trucks, to build really the first of the kind in the world of a 63 ton gross vehicle weight tractor trailer trucks that could operate in long distances running under severe weather conditions that we seem to have up here in Alberta, where it gets pretty cold in the winter. And we want to test and see whether these trucks are actually going to be able to do the fit for service.
Has that pilot project started?
We are flat out in the truck design. I just got out of another meeting about an hour ago on with the trucks performance. It's going to be next summer before the trucks will be out. We've there's been some it's a pretty big technical challenge designing from scratch the two trucks, and you'll be very happy to know that I've not been involved in designing the trucks at all. It's been experts within Dana Transport and with Ballard and some of the other companies that are working with those companies that are actually designing these from scratch and building them as we speak. They're being built in Montreal, actually, and they will be tested, early testing in Montreal, and be coming out here next summer.
You know, I'm a big fan of engineers doing the designing and engineering. I think that's a good principle.
I think it's a good, yes.
Now, by the same token, I also always tell the engineers on Twitter, but you're not very good at politics. Stay out of politics and policy, because stick to engineering and design. That's yeah. Well,
Indeed.
look, let's talk about production costs, because there are two forms of hydrogen that we're generally talking about here. One is blue hydrogen made from natural gas using the methane steam reforming a process. And then the other is green hydrogen using cheap renewable electricity and water. Let's start with blue hydrogen. Well, maybe what we should do is talk about what costs are needed in which markets, because that's part of a study that you've done around the techno-economics of hydrogen. Tell us what kind of costs we need in the various, the power and transportation and buildings and so on.
Well, if you're trying to make hydrogen as a heating fuel in Canada, and actually most places around the world, but Canada, United States for sure, we pay a lot less for each gigajoule, each unit of energy, when we're going to burn it for providing heat. Sort of it's considered a low value use, if you like. But when you're actually buying transportation fuels, we end up paying 5 to 10 times more for a transportation fuel than for a heating fuel. And depending on the price of gasoline for your car versus the price of natural gas for your building. And also governments have tended to, because they don't want people freezing to death, and home is a very basic, the heating for houses is pretty primary need in Canada, and they don't put as many taxes on the home heating fuels as they might do on transportation fuels to pay for roads, etc. And so as a result, it's easier. We can make hydrogen probably at a cost which is acceptable for as a transportation fuel for two reasons. One is we pay more for it, but the second is that when you put hydrogen through a fuel cell to move a vehicle forward, the whole drivetrain is more efficient. It's a typical drivetrain of a gasoline vehicle or a diesel vehicle is somewhere between 20% and maybe 35% efficient. So that means 20 to 35% of the chemical energy in the fuel actually is used to move the wheels forward and move the vehicle along the road. When you actually put hydrogen into a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, you can get probably about 45% or 50% efficiency in converting that chemical energy into motive force. And part of that is because the fuel cell is more efficient. Part of it is the fuel cell generates electricity and goes into electric motor, and they're about 90% efficient. And part of it is because these are electric vehicles, the hydrogen fuel cell electric, and so they have batteries on board. So they basically, it's kind of a hybrid type. They actually, the fuel cell generates, it can drive the motor, or it can actually store electricity in a battery, and the batteries can drive the motor. So when you put the brakes on an electric vehicle, you can get the energy back from regenerative braking and put that in the battery as well. So you get some real drivetrain advantages. And, when you put the vehicle into an idle, in a hydrogen electric vehicle, the fuel cell can just shut itself off, and it can start up quickly. It can use the batteries for the first, few seconds, and then the fuel cell can start up and start providing more electricity. Whereas you don't get that sort of in most diesel engines. The big diesels, they basically keep running all the time.
So my takeaway from this part of the conversation, David, is that hydrogen has applications in transportation that make it advantageous, has efficiencies that might not be the same case if you were, say, trying to burn it in a furnace in a home.
That is absolutely true in terms of our current economy today. And that's where really it comes to fit for service. Now, if you're in a city like Halifax or Vancouver, where the temperatures are relatively mild in the winter, then I think, you could say, geez, the best way to heat our homes is to use heat pumps, where we actually provide electricity and we move heat from outside inside the house. And we can get equivalent of the amount of energy it takes to move heat from outside to inside a house in a heat pump is maybe 1/3 or 1/4, or about a third or so of the amount of energy it would take to actually generate that heat from scratch inside the house through an electric heater or something of that sort. So you can get really high efficiencies, right? Like 200 or 300% efficient. But the problem is when you got in provinces like Alberta, where we spend a lot of our winter at -25, -30, -35, heat pumps don't work. And so what you have to do is, if you're going to put electricity to provide it, the energy, is you've got to provide a huge amount of electricity to meet the energy needs for space heating in the winter. And our calculations, and we're doing a detailed analysis on this now, trying to look at what is the opportunity for heat pumps in provinces like Alberta. Our analysis comes that, we're going to need about 4 times more electricity in each house, right? Now, if you'd have a city, where all the houses all at the same time are using 4 times the amount of electricity that they normally use today, that requires a pretty major retrofit, right? And where are you going to get that electricity from? And the electricity demand is you're going to have electricity capacity made to actually provide that electricity all at a time of year that, from January and February. What do you do with all that electricity capacity in the summer? It just sits around unused. So part of it is looking at a systems level. There might be an opportunity to, there might be more of an opportunity for hydrogen to be a heating fuel in some parts of Canada to meet the actual fit for service.
What about industry? That's an industry that's a sector that I hear all the time is ripe for hydrogen, and we're talking about
Sure.
steel making, that sort of thing.
Yes.
But then there was a steel plant in Hamilton that converted to electric. And I see economists on my social media feeds now saying, "Oh, hang on a second. We thought hydrogen would be big in industry, but now we're seeing some electricity move. Maybe there's more opportunity for electricity in decarbonized industry than we thought." What's your take on that?
Well, I think in steel making, there's a lot of steel making today is recycling steels. When your car gets old and you trade it in, it gets crunched up and then sent to a steel plant where it gets melted down and made into more steel. So that's a recycling. Steel is fantastic recycling. If you're recycling steel, there's a very significant opportunity to use electric arc furnaces. So electricity essentially to help them to melt the steel and to recycle it. If you're making steel from iron ore, right, in where we typically use large blast furnaces today with coke to do it, then that's it's difficult to use an electric arc furnace to replace that. So what we tend to do is if you're actually looking at making new steel from bringing iron ore in and making very high quality brand new steel from scratch, there's a process called a DRI, direct reduction of iron. Now it can use in where we're looking at today is it can use natural gas as a feedstock, and the natural gas almost virtually in the process gets converted to hydrogen, and the hydrogen converts the iron oxide into essentially pig iron or iron that's going to go in and made into steel. There's an opportunity to actually have that as a natural gas feedstock. It has lower emissions than using coke in a blast furnace. But there's a possibility of taking it to a net zero option where you replace that with hydrogen. And so there is a market for both. I think the electric arc furnaces and electricity and steel making is very important. Tends to be, more important, of course, in the recycling. But if you're actually making iron from scratch, then we need a reductant. It's much more of a chemical reductant, and we need to actually probably use hydrogen if you want it to be a net zero.
Well, that's very interesting insights into some of the technical issues in the various sectors and some of the specific applications. So I think that gives us a better idea now of, when industry looks at this, which fuel to use. So the idea of some of the trade-offs they have and some of the complexities around that. So let's now talk about production costs, David. And we'll start with green hydrogen, which I mentioned earlier, made with electrolyzers. Give us a sense of how, what the costs are there and what we're likely to see over the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, if you have really low cost electricity, one can make green hydrogen at a competitive price with making blue hydrogen, but you need to have very low cost. Electricity typically under 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Now the price is coming down. There's also a cost. So in making hydrogen from electricity, there are really two main cost factors. One is the cost of the electricity, and the second is the cost of the electrolyzer. And the cost of the electrolyzers are a relatively high cost right now, but they are coming down, and they're coming down pretty dramatically, and within the next few years. So the rate now is a rule of thumb. If you had free electricity, you could probably make hydrogen for maybe as little as $1 a kilogram. And for every 1 cent a kilowatt hour, maybe $1.20 kilogram Canadian dollars, for every 1 cent a kilowatt hour of electricity, you add about 50 cents to the price of the hydrogen, right? So if you got 4 cents a kilowatt hour electricity, which is pretty cheap electricity, that's pretty cheap for green electricity. If you had 4 cents, you're adding $2 to the price of the electrolyzer cost, the free price. So you're up to $3 a kilogram, which is more expensive than blue hydrogen. And I think that's really the issue, is that can you get really low cost electricity? Can we get the price of the electrolyzers down and produce the electricity? Where green electricity really has an opportunity is that it can be produced in relatively small amounts where you need it. So if you're really only wanting to produce 1 ton a day or 2 tons a day, electricity is fantastic because it produces. If you want to produce 1 or 2 tons a day with blue hydrogen from natural gas and capture the CO2, not possible. You can't capture CO2. It's not big enough scale. We need to be talking in blue hydrogen of 400 or 800 tons a day of hydrogen production, much bigger, centralized facilities, huge, where you're producing enough CO2 to justify the cost of capture and geological storage. They occupy different markets in some ways. There is a role for both of them.
Is there any chance here for small local green hydrogen production? And so, let's say that we're talking about trucking, and yes, which means you have to have a fueling infrastructure. And one of the ways to do that would be to pipe hydrogen around to all of the, the service stations in the various parts of, let's say, Alberta. Every, small town or village would have a fueling station. Or because water's plentiful, especially in the southern Alberta, wind and solar are relatively economic. And could you, in a small town like Tabor, Alberta, Wainwright, yep, Alberta, Devon, Alberta, yep, could you set up an electrolyzer so that all local needs, all the market demand from the local economy is met locally with local production?
Yes and no. So we've actually got a study which is coming out in December on exactly this, where we're looking at a dedicated wind and solar farm that would actually provide a 2 ton a day fueling station for heavy duty trucks. So 2 tons a day, every day for around a year. The analysis was an optimization model. We situated it in southern Alberta. So we've got, how many wind turbines do we need? How many solar panels do we need to get the optimal use of it? How big the electrolyzer should be in order to provide the lowest cost hydrogen to the fueling station. And the big problem is we were using wind and solar data for southern Alberta for the last 10 years to analyze variability and could we meet the needs? How much would we have to store? And our biggest problem is there's every year it seems, or every other year, there's like about 2-week period in Alberta where in the middle of winter, the wind stops. It's sunny, but there's, basically, the days are short. We're talking January typically. And we don't have enough renewables to make it. So we had to then design into this design system, bringing in hydrogen to actually make up for those days. And we can pay a higher price for that hydrogen, but to keep the fueling station running year round. And I think that's kind of the challenge that we were dealing with because this was an off-grid system we were looking at. I think there's opportunities to do exactly what you're talking about. And the economics was actually pretty good, right? Looked like it could work when you're actually considering that you were making electricity right where you needed it, and you didn't have to transport the electricity long distances. We are doing some more work in that area now because we think that's a significant opportunity for Canada. Because there's not only the cost of making the electricity or making the hydrogen, if you make it centrally, there's a big cost in moving it from where you make it to where it's needed. And in fact, that cost can be, especially in small volumes, can be actually greater than the cost of making the hydrogen. And that's part of the biggest problem we have.
So if I understand this correctly, if you've got low carbon electricity at a reasonable price, so under $40 a megawatt hour, and you have all the water you need at, basically in Canada, that means almost zero cost or low cost anyway, you can make green hydrogen for around maybe under $3 a kilogram.
Yeah.
Now, most of the estimates that I've seen so far, given the existing cost of electrolyzers, is about $6.
Well, I think a lot of them are looking at delivered electricity. And of course, we're talking the cost. There's not much profit in that at $3 or very little, just barely breaking even. But also, when you actually buy electricity, you pay a price for electricity, but you pay a price to have it delivered, right, through the grid. So if you're actually relying on grid electricity, it's a typical, you can easily pay 3 cents or even 4 cents a kilowatt hour just for the delivery, and that's on top of the price you pay for the electricity. So then when you're talking $8 or $7 or $8 a megawatt hour, or 70 or $80 a megawatt hour, 7 or 8 cents a kilowatt hour. One is, one's talking an extra $4 per kilogram, right, on the price of the hydrogen, plus the cost of the electrolyzer to the capital cost and operating cost of the electrolyzer. Now you're into your much higher prices, right? 5, 6, 7. And so the issue ultimately is there's also an issue of scale, how big your electrolyzer is, and you can make it work. I think we need we're probably going to need all of the above. I can virtually guarantee we're going to need green hydrogen, we're going to need blue, we're going to need the infrastructure to connect them and back each other up. We have an opportunity with hydrogen is to get, so the electrical system that we have, our energy system for electricity, and the energy system we use for transportation fuels, and maybe even heating fuels, are more integrated and they can back each other up. And I think we have an opportunity now, which we haven't had in probably 60, 80 years, 100 years, to actually build a new, more robust energy system. And hydrogen is part of that. Figuring out how to do it in what area in the best way is a key challenge.
I want to talk about the cost of electrolyzers, David. But before we get into that discussion, please refresh my memory about how we calculate the cost. Is it per megawatt hour, per megawatt?
Well, the cost is there's a capital cost, which is called CapEx, And typically that's for electrolyzer, is it the dollars per kilowatt of installed capacity. So if a kilowatt of installed electrolyzer would actually use in 1 hour, it would use a kilowatt hour of electricity and put that into making hydrogen, right? To do electro. So that's essentially on the capital cost. There's also the operational cost, which is going to be providing the water, providing the staff that's going to have to maintain it, and and all of that, and keep a watch over it. And which in the operating cost gets lower as you get bigger, because you can use your staff more efficiently. And then there's the energy cost, the cost to run it, which is the cost of your electricity. And so you add the three of those together, and that's your overall cost.
Okay, so the cost I wanted to talk about was the cost per kilowatt of installed capacity. And I saw just a couple of days ago an article from a reputable energy website that the Chinese are now introducing to into the market electrolyzers that whereas they used to be $1,200, $1,300 per kilowatt, are now about $350 per kilowatt, and a lot of it has come from the learning curve,
Yep.
just like wind and solar and batteries and electric vehicles, and now that these electrolyzers were on that learning curve. Now the costs are down. Of course, China knows how to manufacture these technologies at scale, and so now they've got. Now, is that a credible report, or because that's a tremendous reduction in cost?
That's a tremendous reduction, and that is still, that is in exactly the range that we've been looking at as well. We're looking at now; those dollars were probably American dollars, so we'd be talking higher than that in Canadian dollars. But if you can get it down to $350 American. Now, the other question you have to watch when you're buying an electrolyzer is how efficient it is. A typical electrolyzer now is maybe 54 kilowatt hours per kilogram, right? How many kilowatt hours it takes to make each kilogram of hydrogen. And theoretical maximum efficiency is about 39. But you want an electrolyzer that has the lowest electricity use per kilogram. If you get it around 50, that's fantastic. If you can get it into 45 or 48, that's what everybody's dreaming they're going to get to pretty soon. The other issue is its maintenance cost. If you might be able to buy a cheap electrolyzer, but if you got to go in and take it apart and replace components, then your operational cost goes higher. So you need to look at, if you're buying electrolyzers, you don't just look at the capital cost. You look at its efficiency, how much hydrogen you get from each size, and you also have to look at the cost of maintaining it and keeping it running. And will it run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? Or if you're, there is another possibility, is that you could get an electrolyzer that might be lower cost, because you're only going to run it when in the middle of the night, right? When the electricity is really cheap. And you may find that then the electrolyzer will last a lot longer without maintenance, because you're only using it for 4, 5, 6 hours a day. When there's not demand on the grid, between midnight and 5 in the morning or 6 in the morning, or something like that, then you might find that that works better. But
Gotcha.
CapEx is really important.
Let's move from green hydrogen to blue hydrogen now, and maybe just very briefly give us a description of how you make blue hydrogen.
Well, today we make with hydrogen today from natural gas. It's called steam methane reforming, where you basically put natural gas with methane in it and water vapor in the form of steam, put it together with a catalyst, and it produces hydrogen. Essentially, you separate the hydrogen, and the CO2 typically is released to the atmosphere. Blue hydrogen, that's called gray hydrogen, and that uses steam methane reforming. Most of the new projects looking at making blue hydrogen, it's going to use a process called Autothermal Reforming. And this is a project where it's like steam methane reforming, very similar, but it uses an integrated process which actually produces two gas streams. It produces pure hydrogen and pure CO2. And so when you actually want to capture the CO2, it's the more cost-effective and more efficient process, right? Than trying to put a patch kit on an old steam methane reformer. But, the scale of these are typically, 200 tons a day to 400 tons a day. The ones that are being built now in Alberta are about 800 to 900 tons a day. They're where the hydrogen is then going to feed into industrial uses. That's one of the challenges with steam methane reforming. To get it to it has to be quite large. But you can capture about 94%, 92 to 94% of the carbon dioxide produced can be captured and geologically sequestered, kept out of the atmosphere. The other issue that's really important in steam methane reforming is what are the emissions associated with making the natural gas in the first place? And I think that's kind of the Achilles heel now, rate of large scale movement to natural gas as a energy carrier, to make hydrogen as an energy carrier, is a lot more focused now on the methane emissions in particular that are released in the production and the recovery of the natural gas. And there's a lot of pressure on the companies to clean that up because it's not very expensive for them to clean it up, and we really need to do it.
Well, I want to tell a little story here.
Please.
3 years ago, I interviewed a University of Calgary economist who had written, co-authored a paper on the methane emissions of gas production in the three Western provinces, BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. So in BC, where they have dry gas, that means it's not produced along with oil, and where they had electrified it, the emissions were very low. They were about 0.3%. In Alberta, which has an older, a lot of gas is produced with its associated oil, and the infrastructure is older and therefore leakier. It ranged anywhere from 3 to 6% or higher. And then in Saskatchewan was off the charts. It was all associated gas, and the industry was doing a poor job of mitigating emissions, and it was just astronomical leak rate. So here's the problem, though. At the end of the interview, the economist says to me, "These are all, we've done good work here. But one caveat, and that is the data sucks, because we don't have the measurement technologies to accurately measure. And so we have no idea. And we strongly suspect that the leakage rate is much higher than the data suggests. And there have been a few studies that have confirmed that. And so now we've got a couple of years, just the last couple of years, we've got satellite sniffers, and we have all sorts of now new technology, remote sensing technologies, where we're much better at it. How does that figure into the conversations that you've had in Alberta about, blue hydrogen?
Well, I think it's those interested in moving towards a hydrogen economy using natural gas are recognizing that if we don't clean up the upstream emissions and put proper rules and regulations in place and set the monitoring, we have the technology. We've had the technology to measure the methane emissions coming off of gas wells, for the last 15 years or more, right? We know how to, I was involved in projects trying to actually get access to the wells to actually set up the measurement system over 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And we could never get access to so it's partly, government has to come in, industry has to cooperate to allow independent measurements of what the real methane emissions are. And we need to be able to monitor some. The satellites are something more recent. The technologies we were looking at were ground-based technologies, but satellite technology allows some pretty powerful ways of checking and monitoring. It's often, these emissions don't emit continuously. They're sporadic and discontinuous, big blast, and then it's nothing, right? So the problem is you need to be monitoring all the time, right? And then we need to, I would argue, that PTAC, the Petroleum Technology Alliance Canada, Canada has done some details analysis of what it would cost to reduce emissions by 50% or more from methane emissions. And they're down, most of it's under $10 a ton of CO2. And so this is one of the lowest cost emission reductions in Canada. could be achieved by better regulation and better compliance to those regulations. So my sense is we really need to start to, we need carrots and sticks on this one. I think this is probably more of a stick, I would say, than a carrot. We need to start charging carbon taxes on the essentially emissions from methane. And I'll tell you, they'll clean them up pretty quick because they can save money. So I would think that needs to be a key part of where we go.
Yeah, fair enough. And we don't, so let's leave that. That's almost methane emissions and mitigation in Canada. That's a big topic all on its own. So let's move on to the costs. My understanding from your report is that the lowest possible cost is about $1.80 per kilogram, which is significantly lower than green hydrogen. Is that an accurate number?
Yeah, I think $1.80. If you could say actually probably $3 or $4 a gigajoule for natural gas would allow you to get $1.80 per kilogram of hydrogen, right? And that's in a big processing plant with 8% return on investment of the capital investment cost, et cetera. And that's kind of well within the range that the companies in Alberta are currently producing hydrogen for and using it as industrial feedstock. Of course, we want to move that into smaller markets, which are transportation markets and local markets. So the price might be a little bit up from that. They want a little bit more, edge margin on that. When you get to green hydrogen, you're easy 2 to 3 times that often, right? So you'll be in reality, and the issue there really is what's the real cost of your electricity and of course the cost of the electrolyzer, as we've talked about.
So to wrap up our costs on the production of hydrogen, is it fair to say that, well, I think we've agreed that electrolyzers are on a learning curve and the cost curve is bending down, has for a while, and will continue to bend down. I'm hearing out to at least 2030 into the 2030s. We expect that costs are going to come down.
Efficiency should go up. Yeah.
Okay. So will we see the same kind of learning curve and downward bending cost curve for blue methane?
That's our blue hydrogen. Yeah, I think probably a drop in the cost for carbon capture and storage. We are doing carbon capture and storage in Alberta now, probably a couple million tons a year. It is being done in some of the early CCS sites that have been set up. And there's good evidence that the actual cost to build those and deploy those at scale will come down. And the technology to do carbon capture is you move from the technologies now have been putting on carbon capture systems on the end of a steam methane reformer, and that's very expensive. But if you were to build a plant from scratch and put an autothermal reformer in that actually gives you a pure CO2 and a pure hydrogen stream, the actual cost per ton of CO2 will come down. And our estimate is somewhere between $70 and $100 per ton of CO2 is going to be the cost considered not of adding carbon capture and storage versus one where you're not putting on. And that is actually that cost could even come down from that when certainly when we've talked to the industry that are doing these things, that as we look at the overall, we start to build a bigger scale of it. We start to put the infrastructure in place that and have multiple companies putting carbon into a shared pipeline for CO2 to take it and set up sequestration sites where they're very efficient. All the indications are those costs will come down. We estimate a cost coming down by perhaps 30%, whereas in electrolysis it could come down 65%. Right? I mean, it could be the numbers that you were talking about, going from $1,200 a kilowatt to $350 or something US dollars a kilowatt. Those are in electrolysis. We're not expecting that size, a magnitude of drop.
Right. Let's talk now about moving it around.
Right.
Which I take it will mostly be done by pipeline. Is there a chance that some or all of it can be transported in repurposed oil and gas pipelines?
Well, I guess I would I would start by saying probably most of it initially is going to be done in a truck. All right. Like we just don't have the pipelines. We got 150-kilometer pipeline that Air Products owns in Edmonton region. And there's another 30-kilometer one in Sarnia, Ontario. But we don't have the hydrogen pipelines yet, and there's not enough demand for using hydrogen as a energy carrier to justify pipeline investments today. So I would say for most of probably the next 10 years, it's moving as compressed gas or as liquid hydrogen on trucks. If you're wanting to serve, say, a transportation market at a fueling station, right? We might be able to get some unique spot. Oh, we can get a pipeline in here, great, right? But so I think in the near future, now, eventually, if we actually start looking at hydrogen, well, if we look at the market in Alberta, for example, this is another study we've been doing now, is we're looking at a projected market for the size of the hydrogen demand in Alberta for heavy-duty trucks. It's about 2,500 tons a day. If we switched over, about 80% of that in a heavy-duty truck sector to hydrogen in the next 28 years. At that night, we're talking, you could see some pipelines going. You got big volumes, you could justify that in pipeline. But if you actually then added space heating and you're adding power generation as other markets for hydrogen, absolutely pipelines are going to be needed. And then the price per kilogram of the moving it drops to almost tenfold from what it would be to drive it in a truck, put it in a pipeline. That's when we really start meeting the benefits of a hydrogen economy, not only for the transportation sector, but also for space heating and power generation. Could we repurpose natural gas pipelines? I know every company and a pipeline company I know is looking at all the different options. The possibility of modifying the pipeline, putting a liner down it, spraying some material inside to make sure the pipeline's going to be is still of high quality and be able to hold the hydrogen without any leaks or without embrittlement, which is one of the big issues of where hydrogen can affect the quality of the steel. And there's even possibilities of putting additives into hydrogen in a natural gas pipeline that would actually protect the pipeline from being embrittled by the hydrogen itself. I think the jury's still out on how the repurposed of the big transmission pipelines. However, there's really good evidence that the distribution pipelines, the pipelines that come to each of our homes and provide us with natural gas, those tend to be plastic. And we might have to change the valves and the fittings on it and maybe the burners in your furnace. But, they could be reused in most cases.
What about, and we'll wrap up the conversation with this. I've interviewed, Dr. Chris Bataille, economist that used to be at SFU, who wrote a paper for the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary about the economics of storing hydrogen in caverns, like salt caverns in Alberta, and then using that hydrogen to replace natural gas in power plants that have combined cycle gas plants. And what's your take on that? Is that ever going to be feasible, or is that just theoretical at this point?
I think a lot of it depends on the scale around it. It's, there's two ways of really doing it. You could have a natural gas combined cycle power plant, and then if you needed to, decarbonize it, obviously you could put a CO2 capture system on that plant and capture the carbon dioxide into it. That's an expensive way to do it. But, if you're depending a little bit on your business plan and when you had to decarbonize, Alberta's at a point now where much of its electrical grid has to be replaced in the next 10 years, right? Because, we've got coal to gas plants. They have a limited lifetime. We need to replace it with a new generation. But that generation, there's no sense building something that you can't get to zero emission. So that's one option. The other option is that and there's a lot of work being done around the world in designing of new gas turbines, which will right now they take pure natural gas, that there's a number being designed. There's one in Ohio that is being designed by General Electric. Siemens has got ones, Mitsubishi, other companies that are build big gas turbines, where the gas turbines take natural gas, but they could take 10, 20, 30, 50% hydrogen if you wanted to decarbonize. And some of them with some modifications could take 100% hydrogen. So one possibility is we build out with the electricity producers within Alberta and across Canada are looking at what infrastructure you put in now, which will position you to be on a net zero transition pathway. Should we produce enough hydrogen that can, and a distribution of that highway, the pipeline infrastructure, that we can get hydrogen cheap enough at the power plant to be able to produce electricity. A typical power plant might need 400 or 500 tons of hydrogen a day on a combined cycle. So you basically need to plan, well, let's build maybe a combined cycle natural gas power plant today, but make sure that the turbine we put in is hydrogen ready. And as we then build out the hydrogen economy to meet heavy transport, to meet space heating, we can tap into that and actually start having that feed this facility with low cost hydrogen. And I think that the issue is the scale. We have to have a plan. We're not going to get the economics right unless we have a plan of where we're trying to go.
Well, getting Alberta to plan for anything in the new energy economy is a challenge, but that's also true in other provinces and to some extent at the federal level as well. So we'll leave that one for another conversation, David. But I do want to wrap up our discussion this way. I think of technology adoption as an S curve. Most everybody does, but let's plot where this technology is on that S curve. My take from our conversation of other interviews that I've done is we're not quite at the inflection point where we're ready. The technology, the hydrogen technology, is ready to compete in the energy market with electricity or with other low carbon fuels. We're not quite there yet. And I guess the question is so if we're talking about the flat part of the S curve, and then there's the heel, and you're kind of heading up to the inflection point, where are we on that S curve in your opinion?
We're certainly at the very start, and we're at the for technologies like hydrogen fuel cell electric heavy duty trucks, we're at the very start. For technologies like hydrogen diesel dual fuel, we've actually got 50 years worth of history. Never been deployed at scale, but we know that hydrogen injection into a diesel engine will reduce its particulate matter, improve the efficiency of the engine, and can actually help decarbonize those trucks. That technology, I say, is the potential further along if we set up the market for it, right? With hydrogen use in space heating, we're probably a little bit earlier stage, because hydrogen bleeding in and go to say 2% or 5% or 10% hydrogen into natural gas, that technology could rise very rapidly, as a partial decarbonization, basically a way to provide a variable buffer in the demand for hydrogen. You got a place to use it where it does some good, but and you could use it as a sort of a helping to build out a hydrogen economy where we've got a place to put it. So and hydrogen and power generation, I think it's probably the earliest where we could see happening in the next 2 years. And we're going to see within the next few months, the first announcement of one where it's hydrogen, reciprocal engine, hydrogen cogeneration, where it's actually making hydrogen is being used as a fuel in a building to provide heating for the building and electricity for the building. And there's some hydrogen engines that will do that right today that are available commercially. So I think that we have a lot of moving parts here, literally, and some of the technologies are more ready for rapid expansion now. Other ones, I think, it'll be probably 5 more years before we're going to see them. But I think in the next 3 to 5 years, we need some pilots, we need the demonstration projects, we need to test things out, we need to have really critical analysis and basic decision of where are we trying to take our energy system on this new pathway we've got to try to get to net zero. What's it going to look like?
So if I'm going to sum this up this way, and I think this is a fair summation, if the very beginning of the S curve is the start, I think, and all of the technologies you talked about are beyond that. They're not at the very beginning of that S
Yes.
curve.
Yes.
And but neither are any of the technologies past the inflection point on the S curve.
That's
So
true.
depending on the application, depending on the technology we're talking about, blue hydrogen versus green hydrogen and all of the, where you're going to, your use case and all of those many things that we talked about, then they're all the hydrogen is between that early point on the S curve and the inflection point. And probably some of them, if I understand this correctly, over the next 3 to 5 years will have the potential to move at least to the inflection point, and then others will take longer than that. Is that a fair summation?
I think that's a fair step. The only exception I would say to that is a lot of the energy companies now are really building the very large blue hydrogen facilities because they're going to take the hydrogen and use it to crack bitumen into synthetic crude oil. They're going to use it to make fertilizers like ammonia like the fertilizer, or they're going to use it to make gasoline, diesel, or materials and chemicals. And there is value in them, and that's going to happen in the next few years. But what that means is we actually have, at least in Alberta and certain locations across Canada, we have a large amount of low carbon hydrogen being produced. And the idea is to tap into that and piggyback on that industrial use of hydrogen to drive our domestic economy towards hydrogen, and that will help. But I don't disagree with anything you said.
Well, David, this has been fascinating. We've had a very detailed and involved conversation. I really appreciate that. And we'll be coming back to you on a regular basis to see how much progress we're making on those various technologies and applications. Well, thank you very much for this.
Thank you. Look forward to it.